Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Commute. My name is Dan. I'm your host today, and I wanted to talk to you about nostalgia. Nostalgia is one of those things that we all experience over time, and I, for one, have a lot of fond memories. I know not everybody does, and so if you're one of those people who had a rough childhood or a rough young adult years, and you don't really have a lot of good memories, a lot of things that you don't really look back on fondly, I'm really sorry for that. I'm sorry that you had to go through such a hard time in your younger life. But for me, when I look back at my childhood, at my teenage years, at my young adult years, at my young married years, that was a time where there were certainly some hardships and some things that were tough. I got bullied a lot as a kid, had to deal with a lot of struggles with being an overweight kid who was also kind of nerdy, who was into things that other people weren't into, not super popular amongst the other kids, not super popular with the ladies or anything like that. But as I've gotten older, I've kind of grown more confident. I've grown a lot more happy with where I am in life and where I've come from. And I can look back at those hard times and realize that those were stepping stones and things that helped me grow into the man that I've become today. And as a result of that, I've been able to look back much more fondly. Some people would say through rose-colored glasses, but I would say just being able to look back and appreciate the good things in my life thus far. And so my kids the other night after dinner posed this interesting question to me about what would I say is my favorite decade that I have lived through. Now, I was born in the late 80s, so I don't really remember the late 80s too terribly much. I was really more of a 90s kid, grew up with a lot of the things that many of us remember fondly. The Nicktoons of the early to late 90s, early Cartoon Network, a lot of just the pulp culture things that we all look fondly back at now, but honestly are not really too terribly popular these days anymore. I came into my young adult years in the early 2000s. I went to college in the early 2000s after graduating high school. Ended up going and getting married pretty early on. I was 22 when I got married, or 21 when I got married. Sorry about that. And I really had a lot of good times in the early 2000s. And so as I was thinking about this, as they asked me this question, I really had to stop and think about it, because it was tough for me to answer that honestly. Because if you asked me 5 years ago, I definitely would have said the early 2000s were my favorite time that I lived in. Especially that 2002 to 2007 era, around that time. Because that was when I was wrapping up high school, kind of becoming more comfortable with myself. I graduated, I went off to college, so I didn't really have that same bully dynamic that I'd had for years before that. I became more comfortable with who I was and the things I was interested in, stopped trying to be cool, and just kind of embraced who I was. Went to college, made a lot of really great friends that I'm still friends with today. That was the time when I became a Christian, so that kind of transformed my life. I met my wife at that point in time. We started dating. We got married a couple years later, so we got married within that time frame, and then really started our family, started our life's journey then. And not to say that the other times before or after that were not good, but that was like one excellent memory, one excellent experience after another. And so for a long time, I kind of elevated the early to mid 2000s on this pedestal about a time in my life that I really enjoyed and a time that I really looked back on fondly. So with that said, I couldn't really think if that was still true, because more and more lately, as I've gotten older and as I start looking back more and more at the past and looking at where we are as a society today, primarily with all of the unrest and with a lot of the social media that's out there, Twitter, Facebook, those kind of places like that. I know I'm showing my age by mentioning those two and not other newer ones, but honestly I don't care, because I'm getting older and I'm really starting to appreciate the old ways of doing things more. I remember in the mid-90s, I think think it was 95, is when my mom brought home our first home computer, and it was the shiny Hewlett-Packard Legend PC running Windows 95. And I would sit on that computer for, a couple hours a day and play the Spider-Man Cartoon Maker program that was on there. I remember she had System Shock on floppy disks that I was never allowed to play, but I remember always seeing the box and seeing those floppy disks in the drawer next to the tape and the stapler and the scissors and all that. We were early on with America Online, so clearly it was not the early internet, but it was early enough in the internet days to where I remember a lot of my friends didn't have a computer and they didn't have internet access. And so I wouldn't go on there too much because I was a little kid, obviously, but I remember going on to America Online. I remember signing in and going to the old World Wrestling Federation website because I was a wrestling fan as a kid. I remember going and watching I can't remember where it was. I can't remember the location in the file directory, but I remember watching the Buddy Holly music video from Weezer that came bundled in with Windows 95. And you could sit there and just watch the full video on your computer, and it was amazing. And I think that's part of the reason why I still like that song and that band to this day, is because it was one of the first things that I got to really enjoy as a child on a computer. Like I already mentioned, the Nicktoons and the Cartoon Network era, Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, Powerpuff Girls. I know some people might think it's weird, but I was a little 12-year-old kid, and I loved Powerpuff Girls. It was awesome. It was a great show. That early era of kids programming, the Saturday morning cartoons, where things were starting to become originals. I remember sitting and watching on, I think it was Friday nights. I can't remember what it was, but it was a lineup on Nickelodeon. No, it was Snick. Saturdays, that's what it was. They would play Rugrats and Doug and Are You Afraid of the Dark, and all of that came out back then, the original, all of that. We would watch TGIF as a family on Fridays, Family Matters, Full House. I can't remember the other shows there. I think Sabrina the Teenage Witch was on there. I remember we would watch Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So many great programs back in the 90s. It really was a great time. And, I mentioned America Online. I know I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm just kind of free-forming right now, no script. And really, I remember getting more online time in the late 90s, in 97, 98, 99. And I was not an old kid. I was probably 11, 12 years old at the time when I first started getting on there more often. And I'd find my friends online. I would find friends from school online, and we would be able to chat and use AOL Instant Messenger, and we'd send emails back and forth. And we were blessed at my house because my stepdad worked a good job. We were able to afford DSL internet, or maybe it was cable. I don't even remember what it was. We had high enough speed internet to where we could play games like Command and Conquer online, and we would play over the LAN with each other, and then we would also play over the internet with my stepdad's friends. And so we would be able to enjoy those kind of things in the early days, back before you had people being crap buckets to each other and being nasty and mean to each other online. And there really was not a lot of online bullying. There wasn't a lot of online scams. There wasn't a lot of people being unkind and unloving to each other online. Not, maybe loving is a weird word, but it wasn't the same as it is today. You could go and browse people's personal web pages and just read about things they were interested in, and they weren't these formal, commercialized, SEO optimized websites that they are today. It was much more of a homegrown experience, and it was a lot of fun. And really, it's something that I miss a lot. And part of that may be nostalgia, but I think really, when I break it down, a big part of that is that I look at the condition that our culture and society is in today, with social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm going to say TikTok, but I honestly don't know much about it. I've never been on it. Don't really have any interest to be on it. But especially Twitter. Twitter is really, really bad. I got on Twitter back, I think, in 2009, and it was an enjoyable experience. I was on there for a while, but I never really used it too much, and especially I deleted it a few times because people are just so mean and nasty on there, and People are trying to get other people fired from their jobs, and it's just a terrible place. This whole thing has become a terrible social experiment. It's gone terribly wrong. And it makes me long for the old days. It makes me long for the time when we all just set up our own websites, or web pages rather, that we might join a blog ring, that we would be able to go and create a GeoCities account and just have a web page, and that was it. This was before MySpace even. I remember before MySpace I had a Zanga blog, and I enjoyed that so much. That's why I still blog today, because it was just a good outlet. It was a fun place to write, share my thoughts. You could customize your site. It was tons of fun. And now it's all uniform. It's boring. Like, at least MySpace, you could customize your page out the way it looked. Get those like galaxy backgrounds and whatever ridiculousness you want to put on there. Put music playing in the background on there. It was somewhat customizable. You can't do that with modern social media. And everything is supposed to look professional, and it's all corporatized, and you've got companies that are on there trying to virtue signal. It's just a mess. I don't really have a point I'm trying to make here aside from nostalgia is a fun thing to consider sometimes. It's not good to live in the past. It's not good to focus so much on the old way of doing things that you neglect where you are today. But as I stop and I think more and more about the past, I think there are a lot of things that we did right back then that we could implement now and make our lives better. So when I think about the question that my kids asked, which decade have you lived through that was your favorite? Like I said, 5 years ago, I probably would have said the early 2000s. Because there were just so many good times, good memories. And I would still hold that is a very valuable time in my life, very formative time in my life. But as of right now, I would probably have to say my favorite decade that I've lived through was the 90s. Because culturally, there was so much that sticks out, that it reminds me of good times back in my childhood. Cartoons that were on TV shows, movies, music especially. Oh my goodness. Early 90s not so much, but especially mid to late 90s I got really into music for the first time. And bands like Oasis and Green Day, and I've been listening to a lot of 90s throwback stuff, and I was listening to Mambo No. 5 earlier by Lou Bega. Man, that's a great song. There's so many other great music that came out in that era, that mid to late 90s to early 2000s. It was really a great time. So I'd love to hear from you guys what you think was your favorite decade that you've lived through. Feel free to post it in the comments below. You can reach out to me from my blog. It is rebornjumpman.wordpress.com. I'll have a link in the description as well. And thanks so much for joining me today. I'm thinking about making this a regular thing, so if you'd like to give it a thumbs up, and I appreciate it. Take care, everyone.